orders not to intervene.
We saw helicopters chasing a lot of people down a road, and we saw the gunships shooting at them. You could see the smoke coming out of the gunship and occasionally see flashes of the tracers, even though the sun had just started coming up.
Saddam Hussein bombing, bomba, helicopters destroyed us. I don't know. They saw this, but they don't know why. We are human like you.
We felt frustrated in the fact that we couldn't help the uprising that was going on the ground for whatever political reasons that were above our rank. And the best we could do is report what we saw and eventually hope that it was taken care of.
A week after the Iraqis attacked the Kurds, the president went home to Houston to celebrate his victory. But the television images of the Kurdish exodus were making that victory ring hollow. The president asked James Baker to see how the situation could be diffused.
I called the president from the airplane and told him I'd never seen anything like this, and that a lot of people were going to die if we didn't do something and do something quickly, and that he needed to really break whatever China was required in order to get it done.
I have directed the U.S. military to begin immediately to establish several encampments in northern Iraq where relief supplies for these refugees will be made available in large quantities.
Once the safe havens were established, the Iraqis backed off, raising questions about how much suffering could have been avoided if decisive action had been taken earlier. The men who planned the war feared what they called a ragged ending, a quagmire like Vietnam, or a stalemate like Korea. They had been completely surprised by what actually happened. Two rebellions, brutally suppressed by an Iraqi military which threw in its lot with a humiliated Saddam and kept him in power. This was a ragged ending no one had seen coming.
At that moment, the seeds of today's confrontation with Iraq were sown. In the war behind closed doors, Frontline investigated how some of the men who are pushing hard for war today reacted to the Gulf War's ragged ending.
But inside the Bush administration, there was an angry group of staffers less than enthusiastic about the way the war ended. They called themselves neo-Reaganites, but were willing to answer to neoconservatives or hawks. Paul Wolfowitz was generally considered the brains of the outfit.
Paul Wolfowitz believed then that it was a mistake to end the war as we did under the circumstances that we did. They underestimated the way in which Saddam was able to cling to power and the means he would use to remain in power. That was the mistake.
That, I think, was a key moment. I know that Paul Wolfowitz was very unhappy at that moment and had argued that we should intervene. It was more than that we hadn't removed Saddam, is that we had stood by and watched people we had encouraged to rise up against Saddam We stood by and watched them get slaughtered.
The problem for the Bush administration at that point in time is that their whole policy toward Iraq was predicated on a false assumption, on the assumption Saddam wouldn't be in power. And so at that point in time, people within the administration have to start picking up the pieces of the failed policy, the assumption that Saddam would fall automatically, to try to find some other way to deal with this. And the policy that they effectively come up with is one of containment.
But containing Saddam would prove to be a big job. Creating no-fly zones, economic sanctions, UN inspections. There were attempts to overthrow him and later even kill him. Nevertheless, Saddam would survive and was always challenging containment. Right after the Gulf War, Paul Wolfowitz began to work on a new policy for dealing with Saddam and the rest of the world. Wolfowitz believed containment was an old idea, a relic of the Cold War. America should talk loudly and carry a big stick and use it before weapons of mass destruction could be used. And if America had to act alone, so be it. Wolfowitz was busy writing it all down in a top-secret set of military guidelines when a draft was leaked to the press.
Inside the U.S. defense planning establishment, there were people who thought this thing was nuts, and they wanted a public debate about it. And that's why they talked to me, and that's why they talked to the New York Times. Well, it was very controversial in Congress, and it was an election year. The first draft said that the United States would be prepared to preempt the use of nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons by any other nation, even, the document said, where our interests are otherwise not engaged. That is to say, in a war somewhere else that's not about us. It spoke of punishing or retaliating for that use, but it also said preempt. This is the first time.
The document outlined 7 scenarios in potential trouble spots. The primary case studies were Iraq and North Korea.
Wolfowitz basically authored a doctrine of American hegemony, a doctrine in which the United States would seek to maintain the position that it came out of the Cold War with, in which there were no obvious or plausible challengers to the United States. That was considered quite shocking in 1992, so shocking, in fact, that the Bush administration, at that time, that Bush administration disavowed it.
I mean, I remember the day that appeared on the front page. I was Dan Quayle's chief of staff. I went to the White House senior staff meeting, as I usually did, at 7:30 in the morning. Brent Scowcroft, the national security advisor, attended that meeting. And though he was always very close-lipped and taciturn about his thoughts, it was clear there was unhappiness at the highest levels of the White House about this document.
The White House ordered Defense Secretary Cheney to rewrite Wolfowitz's draft. Those who know the story aren't sure how much of a role Cheney played in the original Wolfowitz document, but he personally took a role in rewriting it. The new, sanitized document reiterated the nation's reliance on containment and coalitions before taking action. Wolfowitz's notion of preemption and America's willingness to act alone was cut.
Wolfowitz was ahead of his time and really beginning to try to think through the post-Cold War era, but it was not a conclusion that most of the Bush administration was comfortable with.
As George H.W. Bush left office, Wolfowitz's draft plan went into the bottom drawer, but it would not be forgotten. One day there would be a more receptive president and another opportunity.
Meanwhile, President Bush's policy of containing Saddam was playing out on the ground in Iraq. At the end of the Gulf War, the UN Security Council had created UNSCOM and sent UN inspectors to find and destroy Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. In spying on Saddam, Frontline examined the battle between the inspectors and the Iraqi regime.
One of UNSCOM's first assignments was to investigate Iraq's nuclear weapons program. An American, David Kay, led the team.
I must recommend to buy Commander. We were going to use the full powers we had under Resolution 687. We were going to carry out a zero, no-notice inspection, because otherwise we weren't going to find anything. So we suddenly appeared at the gate of a military facility at a place called Abu Ghraib and demanded access. The poor commander of the base that day said, "I have no orders to let you in," but he made what turned out to be a genuinely fatal mistake for him. He said, "You can put up as many members of your team as you want to on this water tower, which is right inside the gate."
The inspectors on the water tower spotted Iraqi trucks slipping out the back gate. Kay immediately ordered his team to chase after them.
Go get him, Kiwi! Go get him, boy! Folks, this is cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians in the desert.
They're now traveling.
The UN Land Rovers caught up with the trucks and tried to pull them over. The Iraqis refused to stop.
In the process, the Iraqis decided to fire shots over their head, but we did get the photographs, and the photographs are damning as to what the Iraqis were doing.
The photographs showed the trucks were carrying calutrons, giant iron magnets which can be used to enrich uranium.
Well, this was the proof that no one could deny. It was physical evidence of a very, very large uranium enrichment program. And it was also the evidence of concealment, that from the very beginning, the Iraqis had not been living up to their obligations. And you couldn't deny that.
That you are in serious violation, a flagrant violation of Resolution 687, and it will be up to the Security Council members and the Secretary General of the United Nations to determine how they react.
The inspectors learned that Saddam's nuclear scientists had made a feverish attempt to build at least one crude atomic bomb in time for the Gulf War. Saddam's chief bomb maker, Dr. Qadir Hamza, later defected to the West.
Yes, there was a program called the Crash program, to use the French fuel, which is bomb grade, which contains bomb grade uranium, extract the uranium out of it. Process of cutting the fuel and preparation started, and a bomb model was made, complete bomb mock-up without the fuel. It was a little too big.
When the war started, Iraq was still trying to miniaturize the bomb into a warhead that could be carried on a missile.
It was close. They had the mock-up, all they needed was the fuel, and the fuel was there, and they needed was to process it. But it was not a deliverable weapon.
It turned out they'd spent over $10 billion in the 1980s to develop a program that explored practically every known way to enrich uranium and to craft a nuclear weapon. This was not a small program. It was one that was so extensive that as an inspector, when you faced it, your mind just boggled.
In September 1991, David Kay led another surprise raid, this time invading a government building in downtown Baghdad, where his team discovered a hidden archive of documents detailing Iraq's plan to make an atomic weapon.
We suddenly were in the building, and the Iraqis realized we had the damning evidence of the full extent of their program, which even then we didn't know. And this laid out exactly in black and white that they were proceeding to produce a nuclear weapon. They kicked us out of the building, literally by force, and said, "You can leave the parking lot, but you're not taking these documents." We said, "If the documents don't go, we're not leaving the parking lot."
The standoff lasted 4 days. The weapons inspectors were held hostage in the parking lot outside the building. The United States declared it was prepared to intervene militarily on behalf of UNSCOM.
The only reason Saddam Hussein was going to comply with UNSCOM was because he feared the American-led military reaction. And UNSCOM knew this as well. They knew that we would not leave them in the lurch.
The threat of force worked.
Decision outcome. I hope there is a decision that will at least alleviate this agonizing situation for you and for me. Okay, please. Please.
In the end, the inspectors were allowed to leave with all their evidence.
Within a year, the United States began to see deep fissures in the coalition that it had built, with 3 critical members of the Security Council, China, Russia, and France, all beginning to call for some kind of easing of sanctions to review the entire process. They all had economic interests, and that were more important than the regional security threat. China and France both looked for economic deals, both for reconstruction of Iraq and in the oil business. And for Russia, of course, it was owed billions from Saddam Hussein for weapons that it bought before the Gulf War.
You got to remember, when Resolution 687 was written after the Gulf War, in the back of people's minds, this was not a 10-year resolution. People were thinking in terms of months. It was very telescoped. And I think the willingness, almost the psychological preparation of the international community was fairly short-term.
In the summer of 1992, a year after coming to Baghdad, UNSCOM launched a major inspection at Iraq's Ministry of Agriculture. But this time, the inspectors would find they could no longer rely on solid support from the Security Council. One of the inspectors that day was an American, Scott Ritter.
First target we hit, agricultural ministry. Surround it, and the Iraqis say, you can't come in. This is a ministry. This is a symbol of our national sovereignty. We said, all right, you want to play that game? We're parking. We're surrounding it. Nobody's going in and out unless they run through our inspectors. And the Iraqis went, all right, we'll play that. And we said, okay, Security Council, they're not letting us in. Nothing. Day goes by. Excuse me, gentlemen, we're parked out in front of the agriculture ministry. They're not letting us in. We want to do an inspection. Silence. Nothing.
UNSCOM was now stymied. It had to find a new way of doing business. To hunt down the weapons Iraq was hiding, UNSCOM decided it must act more like an intelligence agency.
It became necessary because the Iraqis did not live up to their obligations under the resolution to declare everything they had and let the inspectors go in, identify, tag it, and destroy it. Once you were dealing in a clandestine, competitive environment, you needed access to satellite photography, access to signals intercept.
One of UNSCOM's most important tools became the U-2, the world's most famous spy plane. The same plane the U.S. flew over Russia during the Cold War. Using a U-2 on loan from the CIA, UNSCOM collected surveillance photos of Iraq. UNSCOM was pleased with the U-2 photo analysis and the other intelligence provided by the CIA. But on the ground, UNSCOM inspectors were frustrated. When they arrived at a suspected weapons site, it would invariably be empty. The Iraqis insisted they were no longer concealing any banned weapons. They wanted UNSCOM to go home.
In 1995, Saddam Hussein actually appeared to be winning in his strategy of cheat and retreat. He had actually managed to hide so many of his weapons that many of the UN weapons inspectors thought that he had turned over most of them. But the defection changed everything.
In August 1995, Hussein Kamel, a high-ranking Iraqi general, announced at a press conference in Amman, Jordan, that he had defected. Kamel was Saddam Hussein's son-in-law. He was also the commander of the SSO, the special security organization that guarded Saddam. The SSO was the same elite military unit that was hiding Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. In Jordan, Kamel began to tell UNSCOM about a vast arsenal of weapons it had failed to uncover, and how the Iraqis were hiding them.
We were ordered to hide everything from the beginning, and indeed much information was hidden, and many files were destroyed in the nuclear, chemical, and biological programs. These were not individual acts of concealment, but the result of direct orders from the Iraqi leadership.
Now, Hussein Kamel's defection tells UNSCOM that not only have they been missing something, but they've been missing a huge, huge amount of what they were supposed to be finding, way more than they had ever suspected.
And it's out there laid before the world. Iraq is cheating. Iraq is lying. Iraq has not complied, and not complied in a big way. What are you going to do about it? Now all the brakes are off. Achaia said, go.
One of the first places UNSCOM struck was Al-Hakam. Hussein Kamal had said that this was Iraq's top-secret germ warfare production facility. The Iraqis had steadfastly denied having any biological weapons program. But here, the UNSCOM inspectors discovered Russian-built fermenters used to produce anthrax and growth medium used to grow biological toxins. The inspectors buried 17 tons of it and then blew up the entire facility.
But the relationship between the inspectors and the Iraqis continued to deteriorate. The CIA had backed an unsuccessful plot by Iraqi military leaders to overthrow Saddam. And in 1998, Saddam accused UNSCOM of spying on him for the CIA. Saddam blocked further inspections, and the UN pulled the